Leibniz on the organization of life and the structure of ideal societies. This comes as at the convergence of my work on Leibniz's philosophy, but also more his history of science and his interest, his keen lifelong interest in scientific societies and how he cultivated these two interests really in parallel. And so to start with a beautiful picture of Leibniz. There aren't many pictures of Leibniz, but this is one of the most famous, so you can put a name to the face. So far from shunning the infinite, as his philosophical predecessors, Pascal and Descartes, had done, the German philosopher Leibniz, who lived in the 17th century, 1646-1716, embraced and celebrated it, seeing it as the mark of the divine. According to him, the infinite permeated reality in the microscopic as well as the infinitely large, in such a manner that every particle of the universe contains a world of an infinity of creatures. Leibniz was writing at a time of intellectual upheaval. The early 17th century had ushered in an era of scientific discoveries and innovations, an era in which mechanism, as exemplified by clockwork, had emerged as a privileged conceptual tool through which to elucidate and grasp the cosmos, the state, and even the human body. The application of this mechanized world picture to life was pioneered by René Descartes, who in his treatise on man of 1637 effectively equated living bodies to complex automata. Descartes could see no difference between the machines built by artisans and the various bodies composed by nature alone. Leibniz felt that the moderns had erred in ascribing this godless model to life itself. He set out to restore the uniqueness of life by positing that infinity was its defining feature. For Leibniz, even in their smallest parts, organisms were machines, and therefore were machines ad infinitum, akin to onions that you could be completely peeled. Organisms preserved their infinitely nested mechanical structure and always remained the same machine throughout the various changes they underwent, being merely transformed through different unfoldings. Moreover, only the particular kind of infinity displayed by natural organisms yielded true unity, which unity in turn endowed them with sensation, perception, and consciousness. Each was animated by an always subsisting unity, a primitive communications network which also expressed the activity of all the machines nested in it, unfolded in concert with them. With this mechanism, both material and spiritual realms developed in perfect correspondence whilst never directly interacting in pre-established harmony. By contrast, even though the most artfully assembled artificial machine could never hope to overcome its essential state of being aggregated from parts. So more than 3 centuries before debates surrounding artificial intelligence, for example, Leibniz already warns us of the inherently non-conscious nature of artificial machines, although they might behave as if animated by a unifying spiritual force, they would still be essentially soulless. The infinitely entangled structure of natural machines also founds their indestructibility for Leibniz. Birth and death emerge as mere developments and envelopments of a vast living machinery which, while imperceptible to us, radiate throughout the universe and are preserved for all eternity. In a passage which may provide us with some solace, Leibniz elaborates that a natural machine can never be absolutely destroyed, just as it can never absolutely begin, but it only decreases or increases, enfolds or unfolds, always preserving in itself some degree of life, vitalitas, or if you prefer, some degree of primitive activity, actuositas. Crucially, Leibniz's theory of organism provides us with an insight into the kind of paradoxical infinity which drove much of his thought process and which he deployed throughout his system. From his linguistic investigations to his history of the earth, infinity for Leibniz is never abstract or quantitative, but thoroughly embodied, continuous, and infinitely nested, except in his mathematical investigations where he intentionally adopts a fictitious reading of an infinity for practical purposes. As Leibniz himself often conceded, my meditations turn on 2 things, namely unity and infinity. Indeed, within divinely inspired reality, the connection between infinity and unity was not one of simple dichotomy, but of interdependence and variety. Indeed, Even so-called finite human creatures were infinite in their own way. Leibniz's theory of organism is also emblematic of his broader modus operandi, which involved shunning radical distinctions in favor of subtle variations. Far from rejecting mechanism out of hand, Leibniz co-opted it, reworking it to suit his own purposes. For him, organism referred to an organizational principle rather than a particularly biological sort of stuff. He writes, organism, that is to say order and artifice, is something essential to matter, produced and arranged by the sovereign wisdom. Living beings were thus subjected to a particular variety of mechanism which unfolded infinitely and dynamically. In fact, Kant would later draw on Leibniz's distinction between art and nature for his own forays in biology, when he writes, an organized product of nature is that in which everything is an end and reciprocally a means as well. Nothing in it is in vain, purposeless, or to be ascribed to a blind mechanism of nature. By contrast, even the most artfully assembled artificial machines could never hope to overcome its essential state of aggregation in the Leibnizian framework. And as we've seen, this particular kind of infinity displayed by natural organisms alone yielded true unity. Ultimately, natural artifices, natural machines, in the infinite subtlety of their artifice, were born out of divine wisdom separated from us by an immense distance. Therefore, living beings were thus subjected to a particular variety of mechanism, one that unfolds infinitely and dynamically. Leibniz's understanding of mechanism would be echoed many years later by the physicist Erwin Schrödinger in the final section of his famous What is Life essay, which addressed the relation between clockwork and mechanism. He writes, it needs no poetic imagination, but only clear and sober scientific reflection to recognize that we are here obviously faced with events whose regular and lawful unfolding is guided by a mechanism, producing events which are a paragon of orderliness. Whether we find it astonishing or whether we find it quite plausible that a small but highly organized group of atoms be capable of acting in this manner, the situation is unprecedented. It is unknown anywhere else except in living matter. So, therefore, Leibniz envisaged a rich metaphysics of life, which had been carefully designed according to a divine calculus. The whole organic world was born out of the workmanship of God. Each living body, he proposed, formed a kind of automaton, not merely in its totality, but also in its smallest distinguishable parts. Each minute machine unfolded harmoniously according to an internal law, a unique telos, which itself expressed the predetermined plan governing the whole. The world was organized according to an infinitely divisible continuum in which everything was interconnected and change occurred gradually. In it, diversity was compensated by identity in the image of the monad, that foundational spiritual entity which acted as a perpetual living mirror of the universe, albeit from its own particular perspective. Leibniz's philosophy, however, was not a purely contemplative one, but driven by the dictum of theoria cum praxi, namely the idea of deriving practical applications from theoretical insights and scientific discoveries. According to him, the temporal realm should strive to emulate the perfection of the metaphysical realm and man, his creator. He envisaged the creation of scientific institutions that would strive towards the common good and the benefit of mankind, in the process doing God's work on earth. In his early days at the Court of Mainz, which is a period in which I've been focusing that, and up till the late 70s, Leibniz's impulsive reform found one of its strongest expressions in his early projects to organize science and learning through the creation of societies and scientific academies that would contribute to the intellectual, if not political, unification of the politically fragmented German states. This was to remain a lifelong concern. And although much attention has been paid to Leibniz's later projects, of which perhaps his plan for the Berlin Academy of Sciences is one of the most significant and impressive, little has been devoted to his early reflections on scientific and intellectual societies, which he composed either for his private use or, with his patron Johann von Boineburg's encouragement, for his patron, the Elector of Mainz, Johann Philipp von Schönborn. Founding a learned society was a consuming preoccupation of Leibniz's during his time in Mainz. This endeavor provided a testing ground, so to speak, for the development of many of his later ideas and projects, and it reveals something of the young Leibniz's character, ambition, and vision, which were subsequently challenged and transformed by his later stay in Paris. So he drafted several proposals for academies of sciences, some more feasible than others. But as we know, Leibniz was not the first thinker to conceive of scientific societies. Increasing activity in the natural sciences created a demand for new organizations to support scientific experimentation and encourage scholarly cooperation and exchange. Several models familiar to Leibniz, including Francis Bacon's archetype in the New Atlantis, which you can find here, of which you can find the frontispiece here on the left, of a modern scientific organization, the fictional Solomon's House on the island of Ben Salem, with its rational and mathematical arrangement for studying and exploiting the natural world, Comenius's design of a house of wisdom, and the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660 at Gresham College, had been developed during or after the 30 Years' War, when the need to centralize and provide an institutional platform for science had begun to be felt acutely. Leibniz, however, explicitly distanced himself from the more overtly utopian models offered by Bacon on the left, and Johannes Andreae, Thomas More, and he dismissed Cardano and Tommaso Campanella's models as extravagant, lacking in judgment, and even dangerous. And here on the PowerPoint, you can find the picture associated with Campanella's City of the Sun on the right. These schemes struck Leibniz as particularly pernicious in that they misrepresented progress by exalting unattainable ideas that were not grounded in reality, and by presenting perfectly fulfilled visions while obfuscating the continuous and difficult effort needed to realize them. In his early effort to design societies or academies of science, Leibniz found more inspiration in the existing established societies, whether in Germany or abroad, than in others' visionary schemes. He regarded the Royal Society, as mentioned, highly on account of the great value it placed on experimentation. He was also familiar with the writings of Johann Heinrich Alsted, whose encyclopedia emphasized the value of the mechanical arts, as well as Rames's work on practical mathematics, which praised the promotion of mathematics by princes. But given their shaky footings, none of the German societies, such as the Societas Aeronautica, founded by Joachim Jungius in 1622, or the Academia Naturae Curiosorum, founded by a group of peripatetic German physicians in 1652, bore comparison with their English or French counterparts. The Academia obtained imperial patronage only in 1677, when it was renamed the Leopoldina after the Emperor Leopold I. And crucially, Germany's political fragmentation hindered the formation of an intellectual or scientific center and impressed on the young Leibniz the need to labor towards the collective advancement of science in the Holy Roman Empire. Hence his resolve to set up an academy on the strongest possible basis, ideally with the backing of committed and financially reliable patrons. So Leibniz formulated various schemes for organizing German scientific activity. The first was for a learned society, the Societas Eruditorum Germaniae, to be financed by tax on paper. In 1669, aged 23, he prepared a more ambitious plan for an international scientific society based in the Netherlands, the Societas Philadelphica, the independence of which would be ensured jointly by the Emperor, the Pope, and the French King. Although it was intended as an elite organization of intellectually and morally refined researchers, what Leibniz proposed was certainly not a purely contemplative community, but rather one firmly entrenched in society and modeled after the ancient Pythagorean school of philosophers. This morally grounded international society was meant to span religious and political divisions, thus laying the groundwork for the reconciliation of the Christian churches in accordance with an idea that Leibniz developed further in a text from the same period, outlined in outlining a Societas Confessionum Conciliatrix. This worldly order would pursue and promote scientific and technological research for the benefit of the public good. The arts and sciences were to be placed in the service of promoting the utility of humankind, for nothing was holier than promoting the usefulness of mankind. Not unlike the Jesuit order, albeit one excluding clerics and motivated solely by a faith in progress, this society would consist of learned men and artisans from all over the world who would collaborate with other institutions to promote scientific and technological progress, and would constitute an ideal model for the rest of the world. Like the Jesuits too, members would partake in civil society and work as counselors, solicitors, and doctors in the courts, the universities, the armies, and the navies. By performing their services for free, these agents would win support of all and infiltrate the highest spheres of power. For care had to be taken, in particular, that our people are promoted to the highest offices. They should hold everything in their hands. The clerics should become confessants, so that the youth are educated in the truth by us, so that little by little it is possible to take on the Orient under the pretext of medicine and learning, and to establish colonies under the pretext of an Oriental Indian society. To ensure its economic independence and viability, the society would engage in commerce, sell patents, and obtain privileges. Leibniz intended the society to be the foundation of a new European intellectual elite that would guide and elevate the population morally, intellectually, scientifically, and ultimately politically. As he writes, the society can easily attain a position in which there is no longer anyone whom it must fear, and where it sits at the helm of the state. The military leaders can also be duty-bound to society. Ships and settlers can be sent to America. The whole of the earth can be subjugated not through violence, but through goodness. Finally, the whole of mankind will be ennobled, since until that time more than half of them were underdeveloped. The society will even be our referee in wars and easily secure the world against unlawful violence, since above all the members shall occupy the most important posts, be closely bound with the people and in charge of regional governments. Like secretive philosopher kings, an idea appropriated from Plato's political thought, agents of the society would gradually undermine the power of individual states and assume the most important political offices across Europe, including the Dutch state, with the view to spreading wisdom and securing peace, including through gradual colonization. Leibniz's plan includes colonies to be established in America. These agents would not only educate the civil servants, but would also subjugate the whole world without violence or danger, gradually erecting a politically effective republic of scholars dedicated to the perfection of the human race. According to this scheme, science would gradually replace conventional politics, especially in the political organization of society, in order to create a metaphysically inspired technocracy that would finally help cultivate mankind. In 1672, Leibniz wrote two further proposals, the Bedenken von Aufrichtung einer Akademie oder Societät in Deutschland zu Aufnehmen der Künste und Wissenschaften, or Reflections on the Establishment of an Academy or Society in Germany for Fostering the Arts and Sciences, and the Grundriss eines Bedenkens von Aufrichtung einer Societät in Deutschland zu Aufnehmen der Künste und Wissenschaften, outline of a reflection on establishing an Academy of Science Society in Germany for Fostering the Arts and Sciences, which, with Boinenburg's approval, he dedicated to his employer, Johann Philipp von Schönborn, in the hope of winning the latter's support for his national and local schemes. Both read like exhortations to the German nation to unite intellectually, something, Leibniz hoped, that would not fail to strike a chord with the elector, who at the time was engaged in concerted diplomatic and political effort to unite the German princes against Louis XIV. Whereas his grandiose plan for the Societas Philadelphica had described an elitist, almost mystical community led by scientist philosophers, the Bedenken was a more modest endeavor to improve specifically German science. In it, Leibniz presented his own version, somewhat glorified and not always strictly accurate, of the history of German contributions to science, especially in chemistry, mechanics, mining, astronomy, and medicine, from Albert the Great to Paracelsus, Copernicus, and Kepler. He particularly emphasized that although Germans had often been the first to invent and discover things, they had generally been the last to benefit from their inventions and discoveries. Germany had excelled in the practical arts and sciences, providing all countries with alchemists and laboratory technicians, and had bequeathed to other nations military, mechanical, and similar arts, only to see their inventions later imported back into Germany with slight modifications as if they were brand new devices. To revive this tradition of past successes, Leibniz argued for founding a German Academy of Sciences with funding from the aristocracy on the model of European societies, such as the Royal Society. He described how this society would bring together, in what would become, as we shall see, a persistent theme over the next decade, the true promoters of German mechanics, artists, and laboratory workers, whose talent too often had been buried, either because their judgment was poor or because they had been neglected or ill-treated. He writes, "So many good minds could be cultivated and put to use in the country, so many people preserved from impoverishment, so many families from ruin, so many beautiful designs, inventories, proposals, experiments, rare observations, posthumous works of excellent people from loss and oblivion, if in the care of the Republic. Chemists, charlatans, market criers, alchemists, and other busybodies, vagabonds and cricket catchers, i.e. those given to fantastic or pointless speculations, are generally people of great cleverness, and sometimes experience too. It is just that their disproportion of cleverness to judgment, or sometimes also their great desire to maintain their vain hopes, ruins them and brings them into contempt. Certainly, such an individual sometimes knows more from the realities of experience and nature than many a widely and highly respected scholar who adorns the knowledge he has gathered from books with eloquence, exalted language, and other political tricks, and knows how to bring it to the market, whereas another with his extravagance makes himself hated and despised. But wise rulers in a well-endowed republic do not pay attention to this, but need such people, and by giving them stable employment can thus prevent both them and their talents from going to waste. For Leibniz, societies were not merely repositories of information, but should primarily strive towards usefulness and aim to harness science and technology to help better the human condition and achieve the perfectio generis humani. Notwithstanding the many achievements of science, its progress was insufficient. As he outlined in his Grundriss, great inventions often fail to be communicated or developed owing to a lack of funds and sufficient instruments. The situation could, however, be remedied through the founding of an academy that would centralize German scientific research and enterprise. In his plan, Leibniz offered a comprehensive program that encompassed a wide range of activities, including science, medicine, art, history, and commerce, and affirmed the necessity of drawing practical applications from scientific discoveries and inventions within a broader mercantile system. The benefits of manufacture, as well as the treatment of artisans, as opposed to only gentlemen and courtier scientists, as in the Royal Society or French Academy, received particular emphasis. For Leibniz, there was no doubt that the pursuit of the common good and societal happiness depended on auspicious social conditions and the good health of the populace, and it was therefore incumbent on rulers to promote the advancement of medicine by fostering collaboration among physicians and the collection of data. Education, too, played a crucial role in Leibniz's scheme. Through the founding of a national academy and the adoption of rational teaching and learning methods, a new social, political, religious, and learned order would emerge that could one day hope to rival the achievements of the Royal Academy or the Académie des Sciences. Such a society would yield many fine and useful ideas, inventions, and experiments, means of keeping food production and creating factories within the country, attracting commerce in time, workhouses, and prisons, to put idlers and wrongdoers to work, to facilitate craftsmanship with benefits and instruments, to test and produce everything in chemistry and mechanics, to obtain privileges abroad for new inventions, to collect manuscripts and experiments. While The extent to which he thought these early projects were realistic or feasible remains unclear, especially since they generally entailed highly independent and mobile functionaries, a prospect that would not necessarily have recommended itself to rulers. Leibniz lent a philosophical justification to his societal projects by relating them back to metaphysical and theological foundations. He defined the role of science as service to the state, and indeed metaphysically, by arguing that scientific discoveries and their practical applications honored God as contributions to the common good of humanity. Leibniz's Societät und Wirtschaft of 1671 articulated his metaphysical defense of applied science and technology most explicitly in a proposal for a rationally and scientifically redesigned society that would be economically fair and just. Citing Holland as an example, Leibniz condemned the economic disparities by which merchants profited at the expense of artisans. Why indeed, he demanded, should so many people find themselves in poverty and misery for the benefit of such a small handful of people? A scientifically conceived society, an economic policy that banned economic monopolies and favored local production would guarantee a fair distribution of reasonably priced goods, thus preventing excessive inequalities. It would help establish a society that would keep its citizens clean and disease-free, as well as provide free education for children who would be raised in public institutions. What Leibniz envisaged was not a classless society, but an ideal harmony of the estates, in which the masters would oversee the more sophisticated tasks and alleviate the burden of those whose preoccupation with their own survival had hitherto entrapped them in melancholy and even despair. This society would form a collaborative whole that would provide full employment, including to the scholars who were necessary for their all-important conferences and amusing inventions, since no one will work for themselves, but rather in cooperation. Each individual, and by extension nation, would attend to the particular task for which it was suited. Each country should equip itself with the capacities enabling it to produce these necessary goods and manufactured products, which previously had to be imported so that it does not have to rely on others for what it can produce itself. Each country will be instructed on how to exploit its own resources appropriately. In a country that possesses sufficient wool, factories will have to be built for the preparation of the fabric. Another country with an abundance of flax will occupy its population with the production of clothing, and so on. Thus, no country among those which offer the adequate degree of freedom to the society will prevail over another. Rather, each will see itself prospering in the areas where God and nature intended it to excel. These enlightened princes, in fostering and overseeing the technocracies that Leibniz envisaged, would not only reap financial benefits, but achieve eternal fame as benefactors of humankind and reflectors of God's glory. That nothing substantial came from these early schemes for scientific, economic, or social reform, these were, after all, highly ambitious, predicated on a radical overhaul of existing institutions, did not deter Leibniz from formulating a range of such projects later, some more successful than others. The continuity Leibniz hoped to realize between his conception of life and that of an ideal society was not without tensions, and in fact, a certain measure of enlightened despotism and potential coercion. Leibniz offers us the image of a reverie called drôle de pensée, and in this reverie, he includes a most curious and unexpected passage that also highlights the ambiguity of this academy of pleasures. He talks about there being several houses or academies of this nature throughout the city. These houses or rooms will be built in such a way that the master of the house can hear and see everything that is said and done without being noticed by means of pipes and mirrors, which would be a very important thing for the state and a kind of political confessional. Leibniz's Academy of Games would serve to educate its audiences through play, entertainment, and illusion, but at the same time, it would help collect information useful to the state on those very same audiences. Leibniz here hints at the versatility of such a panopticon, including for disciplinary purposes, hoping no doubt to ingratiate himself with the political authorities. The very same apparatus that would distract audiences and lull them into a sense of wonder would provide the state with a ubiquitous gaze with which it would be able to patrol their lives. Leibniz here placed the senses, in particular that of sight, in the service of political power. That which served to experience, observe, verify, probe, and finally elucidate could conversely and disconcertingly be deployed to achieve the very opposite, namely used to monitor and possibly deceive from the shadows. In Leibniz's conception, transparency and deceit could thus perfectly coexist. His long-held dream of a ubiquitous gaze in the service of philosophical, logical, and experimental illumination has now acquired a more sinister sense, hereby doubling as a political confessional for an unwitting public. The philosophical and scientific are here coupled with the playful, which itself doubles as the pedagogical and potential the disciplinary. Leibniz's interest in political control, or what may be termed the state's disciplinary apparatus, has remained relatively unexplored by scholarship. And yet, from and perhaps especially at the beginning of his career, Leibniz offered his services, for example, to aristocratic employers in a wide range of capacities, from the legal to the commercial to the theological. Although he was committed to a number of utilitarian projects for the public good, he obviously remained beholden to his employers. In fact, in what perhaps seems to contradict more widespread perceptions of Leibniz, especially his well-publicized ironicism, he regularly advised or sought to advise on military matters, drafting political and military memoranda, designing guns, or recommending war against the barbarian and calling for the conversion of the infidel. Leibniz would retain a lifelong desire to set up a kind of virtuous absolutist rule, which would crystallize the marriage of power and reason and promote the perfection of man and society on earth, ideally in the image of the metaphysical philosophy, in image of the philosophy he propounded. While seeking to erect a new rational social order and progress towards greater culture was theoretically a noble goal, its implementation was, in practice, not unambiguous. As with many of his schemes, Leibniz did not necessarily work out the concrete details or real-world implications of many of his great projects and abstract ideas, including those aimed at the greater good and welfare of mankind. Leibniz, furthermore, operated within constraints of the prevailing political absolutism of the time, and while he rejected arbitrary rule, he seems to have been more concerned with ensuring the public welfare, the improvement of living conditions, and the virtue of citizens, rather than the dissemination of liberal values of liberty, rights, and representation, such as were being propounded, for example, by English political thinkers. Achieving the common good, therefore, including furthering God's plan according to Leibniz, would require a certain degree of coercion and willful blindness, if necessary, which would appear fully justified in light of reason. Overlooking the exploitation and brutality of colonialism, he speculated at some point that once indigenous peoples had been awakened to the power of reason, they would welcome their conversion to the true faith. A war directed towards taming the beasts, that is, the barbarians, as he wrote, was therefore just. Similarly, in the 1671 addendum to his Egyptian plan, a plan in which he envisaged France's conquest of Egypt, Leibniz even envisaged the enslavement, if necessary, of young boys in the style of Janissary armies, the training of an army of warrior slaves who would welcome defending European Christendom once they had been trained and presumably civilized. Ultimately, too, irrespective of his schemes for philosophical languages and religious reconciliations, Leibniz remained throughout his life, first and foremost in the employ of princes whom he needed to placate, and showed little concern about the implication of the practical implementations of his various societies, and this points to an ambiguity at the heart of his vision. Leibniz thus imagined his society as his societies as autonomous and intellectually independent bodies, free to pursue their own research objectives. However, he struggled at times to navigate the tension between scholarship and power, ideal and concrete, and to reconcile the ideal of unfettered research with the reality of subservience to power. Not only that, as he would quickly find out quickly enough, willing as he was ready to place his knowledge in the service of power, power did not necessarily feel, in turn, obliged to implement his schemes or cater to his vision of learning. Thank you.